It is 2 in the morning, 400 miles from the nearest coastline, and the man in cabin 14 has not felt the ship roll in 6 hours. That is the first thing he notices when he wakes. Not an alarm, not a knock, just the absence of motion, the engines idling instead of pushing. And he already knows what that means before his eyes are fully open. Somewhere below the hull, 4,000 meters straight down, a cable the width of a garden hose has stopped carrying light. He lies still for a moment longer than he needs to, listening. There is a particular sound a cable ship makes when it is holding position rather than making way. A low shudder from the dynamic positioning thrusters firing every few seconds to fight the drift of current, correcting the hull by inches so the vessel sits directly above a point on the seabed that no human eye will ever see. He has slept through storms that would have sent a smaller ship's crew to the rails. But he has never once slept through that particular shudder. His body learned to listen for it before his mind ever understood why. He does not know yet whose email stopped arriving, whose video call froze mid-sentence, whose bank transfer failed to clear. He only knows the number on the fault report taped to his cabin door. A break somewhere along an 11,000-kilometer run of glass and copper lying across the floor of the ocean. Older than fiber optic cable has any right to be, carrying more of the world's information in a single hour than a library carries in a century. His job, for the next several days, is to find a wound smaller than his fist on a strand of cable he cannot see, cannot touch, cannot reach with his own 2 hands, and pull it up from a depth where sunlight has never once arrived. The room he sleeps in is 9 feet by 7, a steel bunk bolted to the wall, a curtain instead of a door, a reading lamp clipped to the frame at an angle that took him 3 voyages to get right. Under the mattress, there is a thin electric pad that never turns off, wired straight into the ship's emergency circuit rather than the cabin's ordinary power. Because in the North Atlantic in winter, a man can lose feeling in his hands within the hour if the heating fails and nobody notices in time. He does not think about it most nights. He only notices it on the rare occasion it clicks off during a power test. And the cold that finds him within minutes reminds him exactly how much of this room is quietly working to keep him alive without asking for credit. He has lived in rooms like this for 11 years, on and off, sometimes for 6 weeks at a stretch, sometimes for 4 months, when the fault is stubborn and the seas will not cooperate. There is a photograph taped above the bunk, curling slightly at the corners from the damp sea air that finds its way into everything on this ship, no matter how many gaskets are replaced. Beside it, a small shelf holds exactly 6 paperback books, rotated out at every port call, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones with a crack in the left ear cup that he has never bothered to replace because the crack does not affect the sound. And a new pair would mean packing one more thing into a duffel bag that is already heavier than he would like. He keeps the curtain closed even when no one else is aboard to see him sleep. A habit from his first year that he has never explained to anyone, not even to himself. Most people who use the internet every day have never heard of a cable ship, and almost none of them know that 99% of the data crossing oceans right now is not traveling through satellites at all. It is running through cables like this one, thinner than a person's wrist in most places, lying on the seabed in total darkness, carrying stock trades and video calls and military communications through pressure that would crush a car into the size of a suitcase. When one of those cables breaks, satellites cannot pick up the slack. There is no backup system fast enough or large enough to matter. The only fix is a ship, a crew, and a claw 4 kilometers long. So how do you find a break the width of a coin? At a depth where the pressure is 400 times what it is on the surface, without a single diver ever going down there. How do you grab hold of something invisible, buried in some places under feet of sediment, and haul it up through nearly 3 miles of black water without snapping it? The answer is waiting 2 decks down, in a room the crew calls the doghouse, And it is not what most people would picture when they imagine deep sea repair. The doghouse is a steel-walled control room with no windows, lit by the cold blue glow of a dozen monitors. This is where the ship actually does its work, and it looks less like a nautical bridge and more like an air traffic control tower crossed with a submarine's reactor room. A pilot sits in a leather chair that would not look out of place in a video arcade, both hands resting on twin joysticks, eyes fixed on a live feed from a robot the size of a small car, currently sitting on the seabed 4 kilometers beneath the hull. That robot has 2 mechanical arms, a set of floodlights, and a claw designed to do one thing with total precision: grab a cable without severing it. The room never fully goes quiet. A low hum from the environmental systems runs under every conversation, and every so often a sonar ping from the ROV's positioning system sounds through a speaker mounted above the main console. A soft electronic chirp that the newer crew members find unsettling on their first voyage, and that the veterans stop hearing entirely after a few weeks. There are no portholes down here, no way to glance up and check the weather, no natural light of any kind for however many days the repair takes. Some men cannot work in a room like that for long. The ones who stay tend to be the ones who found, somewhere along the way, that they preferred it. The technician's actual workspace is smaller than most people's bathrooms. A desk bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a bank of screens showing water pressure, cable tension, and a live optical trace that tells him, in numbers only he can read quickly, exactly how far down the line the signal is dying. Behind him, racks of splicing equipment worth more than most houses hum quietly, kept at a constant 68 degrees no matter what the weather outside is doing, because a single degree of temperature drift can throw off a fiber alignment measured in microns. He has learned to work in this room the way a surgeon works in an operating theater, and in a sense, that is exactly what it is. He is stitching a wound in something that half the planet depends on without realizing it exists. Down another deck, past a hatch heavy enough that new crew members are warned about it twice before their first crossing, sits the cable tank itself. A cavernous, circular hold where thousands of kilometers of spare cable are coiled by hand, layer over layer, by men walking the coil in slow circles for hours at a time to keep it from kinking under its own weight. The tank smells of tar and rubber and cold seawater, and the temperature inside never quite matches the rest of the ship. Few passengers, if this ship ever carried any, would guess that the beating heart of a multi-billion-dollar communications network spends most of its life coiled in a room that looks, at first glance, like the hold of a much older kind of vessel entirely. There is a panel behind the main console that most of the crew never touches. It runs the cooling system for the splicing bay, and it never turns off, not even in port. If it failed for more than 20 minutes on a hot day at sea, the optical alignment tools inside would drift out of tolerance, and the entire repair could be ruined, along with several $100,000 of equipment. The technician checks it out of habit every time he walks past, a glance that takes less than a second. Learned after a near miss in his second year that nobody on this current crew was aboard for, and that he has only ever described once, quietly, to the man who now sleeps in the bunk below his. To reach the fault, the crew first has to find it, and the ocean does not make that simple. A cable ship carries an instrument called a cable locator, essentially a very expensive metal detector towed behind the hull, sweeping back and forth across a search box sometimes 10 miles wide, hunting for the faint magnetic signature of copper conductors buried under sediment. It can take a full day just to confirm the cable is where the charts say it should be, because currents move sand, currents move mud. And sometimes storms from years earlier have shifted an entire seabed 100 meters from where the original engineers laid it down. Once the cable is located, the real work begins, and it depends entirely on a machine that never comes above the waterline. the remotely operated vehicle, piloted from the doghouse, descends for nearly 2 hours before it even reaches the seabed. Its lights the only illumination for miles in any direction. At that depth, there is no daylight at all. None, not even the faintest blue the human eye can perceive in shallower water. The pilot flies entirely on instruments and camera feeds, guiding 2 mechanical arms with a delicacy that took years to develop. Because the cable at this depth is often the thickness of a thumb, and one wrong grip from a machine built to lift tons can shear it clean through. 2 hours down is a long time to sit motionless in a chair, watching nothing but empty blue fade slowly into black on a screen. And the pilots have their own private rituals for it. Some talk quietly to the machine the way a driver might talk to an old car, more habit than superstition. Some simply watch the depth counter climb, 400 meters, 800, 1200, past the point where sunlight from the surface has any meaning at all, until the only light left in the entire water column belongs to the vehicle itself. When the seabed finally appears on the monitor, pale and rippled like a desert seen from above, nobody in the room speaks above a murmur, as if the silence 4 kilometers up in the doghouse could somehow travel down the umbilical cable and disturb the work below. The cruise day does not run on the clock, most people know. Shifts rotate in 6-hour blocks, day folding into night, folding back into day, with no real difference between them out here. Because the work happens whenever the ROV is on the bottom, and the ROV does not care what time the sun says it is. A man coming off a 6-hour watch at 4 in the morning eats what most people would call dinner, showers in a stall barely wide enough to turn around in, and is asleep within 20 minutes because the body, given no sun to argue with, eventually stops caring what the clock on the wall says. Meals are served 4 times in a 24-hour cycle instead of 3, timed to whichever crew is coming off watch or about to start. The galley is small, but the food is good, better than most people expect, because a company that pays this well for this kind of skill has learned that morale sinks faster than a cable when the coffee runs cold. There is a whiteboard by the coffee machine where someone has kept an unofficial tally of days at sea for the current voyage, updated in a different hand every few days, depending on who remembers. And the number on it right now is higher than the technician would like to admit out loud. In the hours between watches, the technician does what most of the crew does. He reads. He exercises in a gym the size of a closet. He calls home over a satellite link that costs the company a fortune per minute, and that he uses sparingly out of a habit formed long before it was ever free. Some men on this ship play cards until dawn. Some barely speak to anyone outside of work. He falls somewhere in the middle, friendly enough during meals, silent enough during watches that the newer crew members sometimes ask if something is wrong, not understanding yet that this is simply what 4,000 meters of concentration looks like on a person's face. What can go wrong out here is rarely dramatic in the way people imagine. It is rarely a storm ripping the deck apart, though storms do happen. And a fully loaded cable ship handling a taut line under tension in high seas is one of the more dangerous jobs in commercial shipping, with enough stored energy in a snapped cable to injure anyone standing too close when it lets go. More often, what goes wrong is quieter. A splice that tests clean in the lab, but fails 2 weeks later once it settles back onto the seabed. A current that shifts mid-recovery and drags the cable against a rock formation. Nobody charted, a piece of fishing gear tangled around the fault that has to be cut away by a robot arm with less room for error than a surgeon threading a needle. There is one failure the crew rarely discusses, even among themselves. If the umbilical connecting the ROV to the ship is ever severed, whether by a snag on the wreckage of some older, forgotten cable or by a sudden current nobody predicted, the robot is gone, not damaged. Gone, sitting on the bottom of the ocean for good. A machine worth more than most houses reduced to scrap that nobody will ever recover. It has happened to other ships, other crews, and everyone aboard knows the story, even if nobody names the vessel out loud. The pilot's hands rest a little lighter on the joysticks after hearing it the first time, and never quite the same afterward. The crew trains for these failures, the way pilots train for engine trouble they hope to never see. Running drills that make the ordinary days feel almost boring by comparison, which is exactly the point. On a good voyage, the most dangerous thing anyone does all week is walk across a wet deck in a swell without holding the rail. And even the most experienced hands never let that habit slip for long. Ask him why he keeps coming back after 11 years, after missing more birthdays than he has attended, after months at a time inside rooms smaller than most people's closets. And he does not reach for anything about adventure. The pay is real. Better than almost anything else his hands could have qualified him for without a university degree. And that matters more than he lets on to people who have never had to choose between a stable paycheck and a life on land. A man with the right certifications on a ship like this can clear more in a single long voyage than an entire year on shore would pay him. And there are very few honest ways to close that gap on land without a degree he never had the money to finish. But underneath the pay is something harder to put into words. Something about being one of a few hundred people on the planet who can actually do this, who can sit in a chair 4 kilometers above a wound in the nervous system of the modern world and stitch it closed without anyone on land ever knowing his name. There is a kind of pride in that anonymity. He has never once been thanked by the people whose calls went through because of him, and he has stopped expecting to be. The work is the reward, or close enough to it that he no longer bothers separating the two. There is also the silence, and he has come to depend on it more than he ever expected to when he first signed on. On land, there is always a phone buzzing, a television running in another room, a conversation he half listens to without meaning to. Out here, past the range of anything but a satellite link, he rations on purpose. The silence is total in a way almost nothing on shore ever manages to be. His wife used to ask him, in the early years, why he did not simply request shorter contracts closer to home. He tried once. He came back after 11 days restless in a way he could not name, and neither of them brought it up again. Some men are built for the noise of ordinary life. He found out, somewhere in his late 20s, that he was not entirely one of them, and the ocean has never once made him feel guilty for it. Some nights, the ones without a repair in progress, he stands at the stern rail and watches the cable drum turn slowly under deck lights. Thousands of meters of it stacked and waiting for the next fault somewhere else in the world. He thinks about how strange it is that something this quiet, this far from anyone's daily thoughts, holds up so much of what people assume simply exists on its own. Nobody wonders how their message crossed an ocean in under a second. They only notice the ocean at all when it goes silent. By morning, the fault report will be gone from his cabin door, replaced eventually by another, from some other stretch of seabed, some other 700-page chart, some other coil of glass and copper waiting to be found in the dark. And by then, his ship will already be turning toward new coordinates, and he will already be walking back down to the doghouse. Because somewhere down there, in water black enough to swallow every star, the world is always, quietly, waiting to be reconnected.